Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Justice Systems 2 panel of Are the Kids All Right? COVID-19 and Youth. I am Avery Irons, the Associate for Technical Assistance at the New York State Youth Justice Institute. Thank you again. We are excited to have this wonderful conversation this afternoon and the amazing panelists of activists, advocates, scholars, researchers who are joining us today. To start with, my colleagues and I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping to orient you to how some things are going to run during this particular panel. I'll start off just by saying if you have any tech issues during the conversation, please reach out to us directly at youthjustice@albany.edu. That link should be appearing in the chat box momentarily. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Alicia Gagnon.
Hello, my name is Alicia and I'm a research assistant at the Youth Justice Institute. Thank you again for joining us. As our presenters today are speaking, you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A section or in the Facebook comments as we go along if you're joining us there. We will have some time at the end of this session, hopefully, for these questions, but in the case that we do not get to all of them, we are keeping track and will do our best after the conclusion of the forum to answer them. We have Angeline McAlpine of Drawing Impact providing live digital visual note-taking, and her screen will be projecting alongside the panelists' videos. You can adjust the relative size of the panelists' videos and Angelique's drawings by shifting the vertical sliding bar to the left or to the right to suit your preferences. Please feel to try that now. This session and all of our sessions are being recorded and will be available to watch at a later point. And now I'll pass it along to Samaria.
Hi everyone, my name is Samaria and I'm a Youth Justice Institute scholar. We would like to invite you to engage with your fellow attendees throughout the week and afterwards on our online Padlet board, which we'll link in the chat. This is a virtual bulletin board intended to serve as a collaboration and networking space similar to at a professional in-person conference. On Padlet, as well as in the Zoom chat, please remember to be constructive and kind as we move through this conversation together. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Giza Lopez, Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute, to present some opening remarks as we begin this session.
Thanks so much, Samaria. If you're new to this event, welcome. If you joined us in the earlier discussions yesterday and this morning, welcome back to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Forum on COVID-19 and Youth. I'm Giza Lopez, and I'm the Executive Director of the YJI. This forum is designed to bring together insights from multiple disciplines and from diverse professional fields to discuss three big questions. One, what are the current impacts of the pandemic on youth? Two, what are the foreseeable impacts of this crisis on this population long term? And three, what practice and policy innovations have emerged out of this situation that might lend themselves to sustainable efforts moving forward? While children, teens, and young adults are not the face of this crisis, a recent report by the United Nations points out that they risk being among its biggest victims. Everywhere, the report states, youth are being affected, especially by the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. Just in the past few months, an entire generation of children have had their education upended. Teens considering college this fall might have to change their plans to help unemployed parents at home. Young adults graduating college now face a dire economic crisis. We know from previous health emergencies that children are at heightened risk of exploitation, violence, and abuse when schools are closed, when services are interrupted, and when movement is restricted. And throughout all of this, members of minority groups are most seriously affected. This is, of course, a universal crisis, and for many, the impact will be lifelong. It is imperative that we try and assess the long-term consequences the situation may have over the life course of youth, and especially youth involved in the justice system. Yet, as the old maxim says, Necessity is the mother of invention. Now more than ever, we're offered the opportunity to rise to the occasion and engage creatively in problem solving. We have much to learn from the kids themselves in this area. Just think about the 10-year-old girl in California who created a plastic curtain designed to hug her grandparents while keeping them safe from infection. Or the teen out in Seattle whose COVID tracking website has become a crucial resource worldwide. New policies and practices are emerging everywhere. It's in our interest to learn about them and assess their efficacy and sustainability. As much of the world begins to reopen, we invite you to collectively imagine with us the future of youth and justice post-COVID. As we do so, let's remain critical. Let's avoid romanticizing the past. The world as we knew it pre-pandemic was far from perfect. Even amidst a dystopian worldwide crisis, racism in the justice system has still found a way to rear its head, as the events in Minnesota and the reactions to it nationwide in the past few days made crystal clear. Let us work to ensure that the new normal we are aspiring to achieve, whatever that new normal is, doesn't bring with it the ugly vestiges of centuries past. We are absolutely honored at the YJI to have a stellar roster of experts lead these discussions over the next few days and help us get closer to answers that will guide our collective work moving forward. We've already begun down that path with the discussions yesterday and this morning. I want to take the time to thank all the panelists, the moderators, as well as our plenary and keynote speakers, Michael and Pierre, and Professor John Powell, who will be guiding us in exploring these questions between now and Friday. This pandemic has made us all acutely aware of how connected we all are in the world. If a crisis like this can ever have a silver lining, I'd like to offer that this pandemic has instilled in most of us a deep sense of collective responsibility, and it has illustrated the critical role that data can play in policymaking. For that reason, in organizing this event, we wanted to go beyond the local and weave together national and global expertise in these areas to capitalize on what we can learn from each other. We're pleased to see that this effort has actually translated into an equally diverse audience. Many of you come from local and state governments from all over the country, as well as universities, nonprofits, and research centers from near and far. Thank you so very much for being here today. I think last time we checked, we had folks from 4 continents and several countries. So I really appreciate your endurance staying with us, for those of you who have joined us before. And for those of you who are coming now, I want to acknowledge that you may be in a different time zone. So thank you for being here. It only remains for me to thank the staff and the scholars of the YJI, and especially Alicia Gagnon, Avery Irons, and Brian Rainey. Without these folks, none of this could happen, and it is incredible to watch their hard work behind the scenes and the level of wizardry that they've engaged in technologically to bring this to you. So thanks to them. The YJI results from a partnership between the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, and the University at Albany. My thanks go also to the YJI's Executive Board and to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for their unwavering support for the Institute. Many thanks also to SUNY distinguished professors and former deans of the School of Criminal Justice, Bill Pridemore and Alan Lizotte, to Professor Megan Kurlichek at Penn State, to staff of the Division for Research at SUNY, and to Diane Serpino from the Tau Foundation for all their help. Let's get started. My next job is a difficult one, and I'll start with an apology. I've been tasked with introducing our panelists, and I've been given very limited time, so it is impossible to do justice to their experience and their credentials in such a limited time frame, but I will do my best. Of course, all of their expertise will just come to life in their contributions during the panel. I'd like to also remark that while yesterday's panels focused on homes and communities, today, this afternoon, and also this morning, we shifted gears to justice systems. This pandemic has most certainly impacted every institution in our global society, and the criminal and juvenile justice systems are no exception. Confronted by the enormity of this crisis, these systems had to adapt age-old practices and shed long-held beliefs. As we slowly begin to imagine what this world post-COVID will look like, we have an opportunity to go back to the drawing board. At the front and center of that process should be, I propose, an earnest desire to tackle institutionalized racism head on and to bring in legitimately and meaningfully the voices of all minority groups, not only youth of color, but those with behavioral health needs, LGBTQ, youth with disabilities, and immigrant youth. Luckily, we're joined today by this incredible group of experts who can show us the path forward, and I will introduce them now to the extent that I can, as I said earlier. It is my pleasure to invite to join us Deputy Chief Administrative Judge EDWINA MENDELSON. She was appointed in 2017 to head the newly expanded Office for Justice Initiatives, tasked with ensuring meaningful access to justice for all New Yorkers in civil, criminal, and family courts, regardless of income, background, or special needs. To serve this mission, the Office for Justice Initiatives administers pro bono attorney and other volunteer programs, self-help services, help centers, and many other resources designed to serve unrepresented litigants. Additionally, Judge Mendelsohn directs several juvenile and family justice initiatives, including the Office of Court Administration's Child Welfare Court Improvement Project and the implementation of the seminal new law raising the age of criminal responsibility in New York State. Welcome to the panel, Your Honor. Also here with us is Josh ROVNER, who manages a portfolio of juvenile justice issues for the Sentencing Project, including juvenile sentenced to life without parole, the transfer of juveniles into the adult criminal justice system, and racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice. His work has supported reforms in numerous states through research and testimony. He is the author of several papers and fact sheets for the Sentencing Project. Josh has tracked the incidence of COVID-19 in juvenile detention, correction, and other residential facilities among incarcerated youth, and the staff employed therein since March 2020. This work has been cited by United States senators, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, NBC News, the Associated Press, and other sources as the definitive source of information on the incidence of COVID-19 in juvenile facilities. If you haven't checked his dashboard, you should. I hope somebody can put the link on the chat as we speak. Welcome, Josh, to this panel. Also here today is RASHAAD Porter. RASHAAD joined the Vera Institute of Justice in 2017. He is a Navy veteran and a senior at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where he studies criminal justice. His work primarily focuses on research conducted with justice system impacted people, communities of color, and government officials. His work also includes aiding juvenile and adult justice systems in partnering with youth and families to bring systemic change. Welcome to this panel, RASHAAD. Now, to moderate this incredible lineup is Stephen GOLDMEIER. Stephen is a public defender and systems analyst. He is currently a consultant with Just Tech LLC. Stephen is also one of the leaders and co-conveners of the Indigent Defense Research Association. He began his career as an assistant public defender in the appeals and post-conviction section of the Office of the Ohio Public Defender, where he litigated cases in every phase of a criminal proceeding, including successfully arguing 2 cases in the Ohio Supreme Court. He then worked in the policy and outreach department of that office, co-leading the design and deployment of a unified statewide data collection and case management system. Then he was the organizational systems analyst at the Bronx Defenders, where he was project lead for a number of process improvement and technology deployment projects. Thank you, Stephen, for agreeing to moderate this amazing lineup, as I said before. Before I pass the baton to you, I want to introduce Mr. Greg Owens, who is joining the conversation today and has kindly agreed to offer some framing remarks as we engage in the discussions about justice systems, COVID-19, and youth. Greg is a licensed master social worker. He's the Deputy Commissioner and Director of the Office of Youth Justice with the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. He worked for the New York State Division for Youth within the Office for Children and Family Services for over 30 years and has held many leadership positions, including the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Collaborations within the Division of Child Welfare and Community Services, where he was responsible for the agency's race equity and cultural competence efforts, and the Fatherhood Program. He has conducted trainings and workshops in many states, including sessions on the intersectionality of the work of leadership development, managing difficult conversations, cultural competence, and unconscious bias. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Owens and thank him very much for offering these remarks. Greg?
Thank you so much, Jiza. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this auspicious panel today. I want to also recognize the leadership of the Division of Criminal Justice Services, our Commissioner, Mike Green, our First Deputy, Mark White, who very much are supportive of this work. And without them, you know, the agency could not move forward with the lens of dealing with unconscious bias, the mind science of bias, and racial equity. I wanted to just take a few minutes also to frame what I think could be part of our conversation, because I think that the question of how young people are doing in the midst of the COVID pandemic has now been catapulted to a different level with something who has been a part of the fabric of the United States and other countries historically forever. And that is this notion of structural and institutional racism. And so the question has been asked, well, why is there such great disparity in certain communities? And that question can be answered partly by understanding that in the history of this country, those communities as they developed have always been under siege, underserved, targeted, and not given the resources that they need to flourish and to be part of the American fabric. And so there is a history to this that needs to be understood. I think there's also this opportunity to look at this as a cross-systems issue. Young people don't operate in the silos of our systems and our structures. They move throughout the systems as most of us do. And so for youth justice to believe that we are the only ones who can resolve the problems of a just and fair society for young people misses the opportunity to have this conversation about what that looks like in education and health and housing and employment. And so I think the opportunity to look at this from a cross-systems perspective is critically important. The disparities that exist in every single system, and the impact of structural and institutional racism happens in every circumstance and system. So we've got to look at this in kind of a network and a web. I think you can easily say that despite our best efforts, these disparities are predictable. And that's the unfortunate notion of these disparities. You can predict that they are going to impact certain people in certain communities in an adverse fashion. And so the absence of equity makes us be able to predict. But if you can predict this, then you can plan for it. And so a pandemic that had adverse impacts and has adverse impacts on certain communities should not be a surprise because of history and the predictability of it. I think the notion of bringing data into the conversation is critically important for us. Otherwise, there's a lot of anecdotes. And while I recognize the power of the narrative and the need to include the narrative and data probably make the human and business case for any of this work that we have to do. So data is critically important. I think we need to focus on this until something changes. And so in my experience, part of the reason I have these headphones on is because I was a DJ a long time ago, so I've been around for a moment. And in my experience, this thing with young people, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the notion of what happens when they interface with our various systems, or what happened with Mr. Floyd and has happened in many other cases in our communities, when we don't deal with an equitable and just justice system, will simply go away when the next high priority issue comes along. And so I think it's important to focus until something changes and to be persistent until we get the outcomes we see. If you take a look at disparities and disproportionality in the youth justice world, we began to talk about this in the 1980s, and we are now in 2020 and have not yet resolved it. We've had some improvements, but the disparities still exist. So we have to focus and be persistent, and that's a leadership perspective. I think we have to take a look at what healing looks like in these communities so that people can finally heal. Sometimes we ask them to kind of manage it and give them the skills to withstand it. But healing means that you have actually gotten to the place where you're no longer hurting. And so we have to pursue healing, in my humble opinion, as an outcome. I think we heard some of that yesterday afternoon with the panels talking about healing-centered engagement, which is some work we're bringing to New York State very, very soon. And then I think we have to talk about sustainability and be prepared, particularly those of us who have been around for a moment, to pass this baton to the next generation or the next group of people in a fashion that allows them to do this work in a meaningful way. And so that's why I'm glad that there's younger folks on this panel. We're all still learning, but at some point in time, there's an exit strategy for some of us who have been around for a moment, and we have to be ready to pass the baton to the next group of people who are going to do this work. And that's why I think that this panel and this opportunity is so very important. So I'll close by saying thank you so much for that, and I look forward to our conversation. I'm going to pass this back to Stephen to continue the process.
All right. Thank you so much, Greg. Those comments are so important, and that context is just so important for the conversation we're having today. It would be absurd to not recognize that context as we're having this conversation. I would like to thank the YJI, GISA, and the whole staff for this, their introductions, and also this opportunity to join this innovative event, and especially this panel of thinkers, but also doers. I think everybody on this panel really appreciates the link between research and thinking and thoughtfulness, but also creating action and results out of our thinking. I work in systems, primarily in technology, but a key to developing functional and humane systems on a small scale is to think about how they interact with or even mirror the larger systems. And so Greg's highlighting the importance of systems and how they interact with each other really appeals to me. I would also be interested to learn more about our attendees and what kinds of people have signed up to join us today, the diversity of our audience. And I believe the YJI Alicia have prepared a poll, sorry, for the audience. So if you wouldn't mind adding your vote to that poll, that would really help me at least have a look at what kinds of folks we have in the audience with us today. So with that said, we'll jump right in, and I'll bring in the actual experts. I hope I add a lot to the conversation, but the meat of the conversation is coming from our panelists. And we'll start with our round one question. And that is related to the work that everybody was doing before the crisis hit, before the COVID-19 crisis really kicked off. I would love for our panelists to each provide a brief minute or so overview of the pre-COVID-19 state of their work and the populations they were working with, and also what kind of impacts they're seeing now that we're a few months into this on the youth, the families, and the service provision. What, from their vantage point, what impacts are happening. The first I will ask to comment on the state of their work in the moment is Judge MENDELSON. if Judge Mendelsohn, you could share just a brief insight into what you were doing right before and how the pandemic has hit right in the moment.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to participate in what has been a phenomenal forum. I thank you for that. I serve as a judicial policy leader for the New York State court system in a variety of ways that touch children, youth, adolescents, and their families. I oversee initiatives in child welfare, family justice, juvenile justice, emerging adult justice, and adolescent justice. Before our COVID-19 era of crisis, I use certain words to describe the work that we were engaged in. There was a great deal of hope, excitement, and promise. And the reason for that here in New York, we had just successfully began or completed our initial implementation of the law raising the age of criminal responsibility. We were successful in reducing the adult justice system touch on youth in our communities. And we saw improved outcomes for our young people and their families in our communities without an increase in crime or community harm that some expected to occur. So that's why I was feeling so hopeful and excited and a great deal of promise. And then we entered COVID season. And the honest words that replaced those other words that I just used were fear and deep, deep concern. Our society and our world were experiencing shared trauma in this COVID crisis era, and losses, everyone experiencing losses at rates and experiences that none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. And then recently, very recently, we are adding to and compounding this pain, this trauma, this hurt that we were experiencing in our COVID-19 season of crisis with our world and our nation, sharing new but familiar pain and trauma caused by witnessing deaths of Black men and Black women. And the most recent example has been displayed over and over again on our screens and our devices, and concerns about our justice system response in this season and beyond this season. So these recent events, and I'm being completely transparent as I tend to be, add a bit of despair to those feelings of deep concern and those feelings that I was already experiencing of fear about the work and what is ours to do in our work. But I'm no longer feeling that excitement and great promise that I was feeling before, to be honest. But I am heartened that one word does remain from the pre-COVID season. And that word, although it's a bit more difficult to hold on to this, is hope. That word hope still remains for me. The hope is feeling a bit fragile and a bit frail right now and a bit frayed, but it's still there. And I will tell you, it's still there, not just for me. It's there for all of the people who are listening, willing to learn in this forum, participating as attendees and panelists and organizers, and showing up for this youth justice work in this season and beyond. I, on my daily walks, have been seeing some lawn signs and window signs, saying a variety of things that I'm sure we are all seeing in this season. And I took a picture of my favorite one, and it calls to me because this is what we are called upon to do in this season. It says, we can create something better. And in our present work, that's our calling, that's our mandate. As we plod through, this crisis of pandemic isn't over, so we're plodding through and hoping to get to the other side of this And we're also plodding through and hoping to get to the other side of this community crisis that we are all experiencing. And I'm going to hold on to the thought that we can create something better. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Mendelsohn. Really inspiring, poignant, really important perspective. I think the keywords of trauma, but also hope are going to be really in the air for everybody who's really dealing with this crisis and trying to solve the problems of it. I will now turn to Josh ROVNER to talk a little bit more about the state of your work right before the crisis, and then what the immediate impact of the crisis has been on your work.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much to the Albany for inviting us all here to talk today. It's really humbling to follow Judge Mendelsohn, because I'm feeling a lot of what she is feeling, that, you know, my work had been quite inspirational in a lot of ways. We have been successful in raising the age to add more kids into the juvenile system who never should have been part of the adult system. Juvenile prisons are closing. There's way fewer kids getting locked up. There is an important underlying current that we can't ignore, which is that many of the reforms have benefited white youth much more than they have youth of color. So despite the fact that we've shrunk the size of our juvenile justice system, African-American kids are about 4.5 times as likely as white kids to be incarcerated. And that's not because of differences in behavior, that's because of differences in the way that, you know, ordinary adolescent misbehaviors are dealt with when the kid looks something like me or when the kid doesn't. That was where I was spending a great deal of my time. There's been a great deal of change in the juvenile justice system. It's smaller than it was. Those changes have been very hopeful for me. And I think that what I feel as we move forward, because the system continues to shrink, and I'll get into that a bit more later, that perhaps we can in fact create a new normal, something better, as the judge said, that comes out of this, even smaller, more focused, more tailored. You know, I started counting the incidence of COVID-19 in juvenile facilities because it was a concrete question that I could wrap my head around. You know, I find myself as very much the data guy in a lot of the coalitions that I work in, and to just count day by day, state by state, facility by facility as we find out about these cases, it really lets us see exactly what's happening. And last update, around noon today, there's 537 kids who've tested positive for COVID-19 who are in our facilities in this country. And it's just appalling. The reason that I took up this cause is that because the most obvious solution to what's happening aligns with our long-term mission at the Sentencing Project, which is that we should be incarcerating as few people as possible and for as short an amount of time as possible, and to let more people out when we know that 70% of the kids who are locked up on a typical day haven't been charged with or accused of, convicted on, adjudicated delinquent on a serious violent offense. We are locking up kids who have violated the terms of their probation for drug charges, property offenses. That's who we're locking up. And that's who is getting sick as a result now. So I'm very thankful to be part of this conversation and very happy to continue it.
Thanks so much, Josh. Really appreciate it. And really appreciate the sort of data approach, as Greg mentioned also. The data approach is going to be really useful throughout this process. Last and definitely not least, I'd like to invite RASHAAD to give us a snapshot of where your work has been right before the crisis, and also what the immediate impact on the crisis has been on the work that you're doing. Thanks very much.
There it is. Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone. I'm RASHAAD Porter. I'm a research associate at the Vera Institute of Justice, where I work in the Center on Youth Justice. I think in order to best explain where my work kind of left off before COVID, let's talk a little bit about the work itself. I break it up into two buckets, really. one in which I work primarily in juvenile justice system, different jurisdictions, partnering with different jurisdictions across the country to bring that systemic change in partnership with families and communities and young people. And another bucket of work, a values-led initiative where we partner with prisons and jails across the country and those who work inside them, those who are incarcerated there, to pilot a new way of doing things, abandoning traditional policies and practices, adopting more liberatory practices, if you will, imbued with human dignity and so forth. So going back to late February or early March, in late February, I was in Harris County, Houston, Texas, providing research and leveraging that, again, with people who live and work inside the facilities there in their juvenile facilities to bring about systemic change. In a lot of ways, my heart and my mind is still with them. My heart and my mind is still there. Thinking about the young people who are still incarcerated there, you know, they aren't getting the services that they're accustomed to. I'm sure that they want to be home with their families. And in early March, I was in Idaho. Again, doing research, this time in an adult prison setting. And I remember getting up early in the morning when we got the call, and basically Corona had hit the fan and we had to cut things short. Though the work is still the same, we've had to be a bit creative and innovative in the way that we do it, as the virus prevents us from having that face-to-face contact that we're used to in the way that we do our work. And I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to elaborating later.
Thanks very much, RASHAAD. You're not the first to report that assessment efforts are even grinding to either a slow or a halt because of the inability to work face-to-face with people that we want to help. I think we'll start seeing the poll results soon to get a better sense of the audience that's here with us. But as we see that come up, we can see that we actually have 12% of our attendees are parent, family, or youth, sort of community members. We have 9% concerned community members, and those numbers are heartening. I obviously wish we had even more of those folks, but it is good to see a presence from folks who are directly impacted or a member of the community who are concerned about these issues. So with that, let's turn to our sort of round two questions. What has been the immediate response after the pandemic hit? You know, how have things shifted in the work that all of our different panelists are doing? So we'll start again with Judge Mendelsohn. From your vantage point, how have court processes changed in response to the pandemic, and how have these changes impacted different subcommunities of New Yorkers that you work with?
So hello again. We experienced a dramatic, immediate change in how we operate our courts and how we interact with its users and its impacted stakeholders. Like other jurisdictions, we were experiencing and operating under our governor's executive orders, requirements that we pause, and there were stay-at-home orders issued. And those were for our safety and protection, and they were followed by a series of court leader, chief judge, administrative orders talking about the work that we do and guiding us in the work that we do in our courts. In the earliest stages of the pandemic, which hit us particularly hard in New York State and in particular New York City, literally overnight, our courts were compelled to move from very, very busy, in-person, active, frequent places of frequent court appearances and a lot of physical activity of people in our court spaces to a system where we were compelled to reduce our operations to only essential and emergency matters. using technology, and technology that was not made for the way we are using it now. We were compelled to create and implement innovations with very little notice and very little time to plan. We started hearing our cases virtually, and by virtually I mean by video conference and by telephone, with very few people actually remaining in our courthouses and court buildings for those safety reasons that we are all aware of. And it wasn't just a New York State phenomenon. In an earlier presentation as part of this forum, someone from a different jurisdiction was describing, when talking about the impact on children and youth, what's going on in our COVID era. She described her juvenile courts in her area of the country as operating on a quarter tank of gas. And continuing to operate in that way as they go through the crisis. So we responded to a crisis under a great deal of pressure. But throughout the crisis, I can say to you that we always prioritized new arrests. They were always addressed promptly. We continued our criminal court arraignments and our family court juvenile justice first appearances 7 days a week and nights as well. They were always considered essential and in need of immediate attention because at the point of arrest and arraignment and first appearance, we're making those very, very important determinations as to whether or not there will be confinement resulting. So that was always a priority for us in the courts, but we did do it differently, moving from in-person operations to virtual video and telephone operations for those appearances. The majority of youth are released either to programming or to their parents' care or to their on their own supervision in New York State. And we maintained a relatively high rate, what I consider a high rate of release of 80% and greater throughout the pandemic, which is what we had before. So we have a system where, despite the fact, and I think it's worth mentioning when we're talking about the impact of COVID on different communities, we have relatively low levels of detention and youth in confinement. But those rates of confinement are not, there's disparity in that, and that Greg Owens set the stage for that we've been trying to address those disparities and the racial disparities and ethnic disparities in our system for many years now. So while we had always, in terms of the differences in our operations, we from the very start were focusing on young people who were arrested and addressing their cases as quickly as possible in our justice system. The cases that were already pending in our system took a bit longer to address. And we did address the confinement status of youth in all of our court systems at all stages of the court process, either with attorneys, defense attorneys coming in and making their applications to the court to have their clients released, or the courts themselves calling in parties for conferences that were conducted virtually, but hearing from everyone and making determinations as to whether youth would continue to be confined. In terms of the changes in our court operations, as I mentioned earlier, we recently raised the age of criminal responsibility in New York, which created a transfer process of cases from the adult justice system, where all felony cases for 16 and 17-year-olds must start in the adult justice system in New York. The process to divert those cases from the adult justice system to the family youth justice system, the juvenile justice system, never stopped throughout the time that we have been facing this crisis. And the activities of the departments of probation responsible for doing that diversion throughout the state of New York was ongoing. You asked about whether or not different populations in this question are impacted differently as a result of the reduced and different court operations that we have going on. And I would say that there are a number of populations that are feeling the crisis a bit more as it relates to our juvenile and adolescent justice system, in both the juvenile justice system and in our adult system, youth parts, where we address young people who are charged with felonies. The youth who are awaiting sentencing in all of our systems, we are not transferring youth from one facility to another when we have this public health pandemic. So though that population of young people, their cases, in a sense, are on pause. Cases that are pending with timeframes that have been suspended by the governor's executive order, has impacted all of our system players. We aren't hosting grand juries during this time frame for obvious reasons. We cannot congregate large groups of people in our courthouses for everyone's protection. So we had to replace that with a preliminary hearing process. We cannot conduct jury trials for the same reason. So if that is what a particular situation is awaiting, a trial or a suppression hearing, we are simply not able to conduct those at this time. So those who are waiting for that part of the court process are not able to have their cases move forward. And I would also say that those who remain confined, it is a difference to have your case pending and not able to move forward if you are at liberty. And I have to say that those who are confined, and as I mentioned, we are at very low numbers. Over the course of the last 10 or more years, we have dramatically reduced our arrests of young people as well as adults, but dramatic drop in arrests throughout the state of young people, and an equally dramatic reduction in the young people that we confine in our system. But if you are confined and awaiting to have your case proceed when we can't proceed as we normally would, you are differently impacted. And the final population I'll mention, although much of the focus of this program has been on youth, their families, and the impact of COVID on all of them, recognition has to be made that as we have our court system operations reduced and paused, people who have been victimized by crimes have also had their court process on hold as we go through this. And I like to always make the point that when we're talking about those who are victimized in our communities, they are from the same communities and the same communities of suffering that we care about, who are arrested and accused of offending. They're the same community members, and their proceedings are put on hold as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Mendelsohn. I know I've seen throughout the state in the work that I'm doing also, people talking about how do we start attending court hearings virtually, how do we file documents when there's not necessarily formal e-filing processes yet in place. And so it's interesting to hear your perspective on that and see how it mirrors with the struggles that people are having all over the state, unfortunately trying to adjust, but I know the court system's trying to adjust rapidly. So I've seen that in my own work as well. Thank you for sharing that perspective. We'll turn to Josh now to get a sense of what's happening, if possible, from sort of a more nationwide perspective on what these immediate impacts have been. How have state and community level processes changed? How have systems responded across the country? Are there shifting objectives legislatively or otherwise? And also if there are any unintended consequences that we're seeing of this dramatic shift that you can report back.
Thanks. So I'm going to start backwards. I'm going to start with the unintended consequences, because I think something very interesting has happened. I don't think anyone intended when we shut down the economy in this country that there would be such an impact on the justice system generally. So for example, one of the things that's happened is school-based arrests have plummeted because the schools are closed. Now in North Carolina, 44% of the kids who end up in the courts are there because of a school-based arrest. Shoplifting is down because stores are closed. Drug markets have been interrupted because we are all stuck at home. So as a result, the main common reasons, not the underlying reasons, but the direct causes that often lead kids into juvenile courts, those things are vanishing. So as a result, on top of the long-term drops in youth incarceration that I touched on earlier, things have really accelerated quite a bit. NEAKC just came out with some data on the sites that they manage through their detention alternatives, that 50% drop in intakes at the detention centers in the counties that they're located have occurred over the last couple of months. 50% drop in intake. That led to about a 33% drop in the detention population. So some of this is intentional and some of it is residue. Some of it is choosing to divert more kids. Some of it is choosing not to send a kid to a detention center who otherwise would have been. And I think Judge Teskey in Clayton County, Georgia has been so eloquent about the decision not to detain and to try to get as many kids out as possible. Now, as the system has been shrinking in this way, there's also the inertia of the system anyways. So right now there's about 250 kids committed in the state of New Jersey. 55 of them are scheduled to go home anyway this calendar year. So there's no reason to think that we can't accelerate on top of that. You know, our prisons are not that great at rehabilitating that the next 3 months are so essential. So there's reason to think that we can continue this acceleration. So there's definitely been some very good examples. The governors in Colorado and Michigan have been doing just about everything in their power, which in many cases, particularly in Michigan, is kind of limited. The counties have a lot of power in the Michigan juvenile justice system to determine what happens there, but urging the counties to do so. And Colorado has been looking to release kids who are committed into their facilities. What I'm seeing is some jurisdictions that are making an effort to respond and some places that aren't. I came across an article this week that talked a bit about what Judge Mendelsohn was saying about shifting to virtual hearings in many cases. And so this called out Louisiana. And the parishes in Louisiana have looked at detention hearings and have been able to use Zoom, meeting the way that we are now online. The judges, the prosecutors, the public defenders. The one exception to that is Orleans Parish, which is 60% African American and is even higher than that when it comes to the kids who are put into the court system. So I just often wonder to what extent players recognize the urgency of what we're facing and whether they are going to respond accordingly. Certainly the inertia of the system in some ways has worked positively, like what I was saying in New Jersey. But the advocates there have been urging even greater release of incarcerated young people, and I think they are right to do so. The question we should all be asking ourselves is whether this new, smaller system can be a new normal coming out of this. We should be able to close a number of juvenile prisons. The state of Maryland, where I live, where I'm talking to you from today, is going to be closing 2 of its juvenile prisons because they are basically empty right now. There's, I don't know, 80 staff guarding 10 kids, 7 girls, 7 boys, 3 girls, and there were 80 staff members. That doesn't even include the number of people who are coming in to, you know, deliver the meals. There is so much waste in the system, and waste that ought to be focused on places that can make a difference in making these kids' lives better.
Thanks very much, Josh, for that wider lens perspective on what we're seeing. And it's in some places, as you mentioned, heartening to see the system realize it didn't need to be as big as it was, and in other places not as heartening to see sort of people holding on to the way that they used to do things. It was also nice to see Judge Teskey in the last panel talk about some of the specifics of his efforts to really help move people out of the system and really relieve the tension in that way. So I appreciated that perspective also. We'll now turn to RASHAAD to talk a little bit more about specifically restorative justice practices. RASHAAD, we often think about restorative justice on an interpersonal, smaller level, but if we widen the lens and think systematically, in this sort of context, what are the opportunities for systems to adopt a restorative orientation? And what does this look like concretely in daily operations, in interactions between the system and the community, especially in this situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So to your question, I think I have 4 points to make here. Acknowledge history to start with. 2, situate yourself in it all. Thirdly, partnership, work together. And lastly, trust in leadership. So if I could expand on my first point about acknowledging the history, restorative justice asks 3 questions. What happened? What was the impact? And how to repair the harm that was done. So acknowledging the history, right? We have to, although COVID-19 is fairly new, mass incarceration is not. And that history goes back centuries. So anything other than acknowledging that history denies not only my oppression, but thereby normalizes it and dehumanizes the plight of people. Secondly, to situate yourself in it all, don't remove yourself from it. I've been in spaces where we've provided technical assistance and, you hear things like, well, I didn't own slaves, so why do we have to talk about racism? We can't remove ourselves from it all. We all have a role to play and a social and moral responsibility. And to the third point about partnership, in partnership with the people that live and work inside of prisons, we have what's called an assessment phase of our research process, where we're looking at the culture of an institution. Let's expose our power relationships and how these relationships influence and shape policy and practice. And we understand that culture is not a discrete entity removed from its political and social context. So I think that we also need to measure the culture in our society by similar standards, not in the way of value-free scholarship, but of radical social reconstruction. And my last point, trust in the leadership. So thinking specifically of the system stakeholders, those who work for the DOCs and the JJCs, if you will, they've been trained to distrust, the people that they have in their custody. But what's different about the work that we do is that we not only listen and give people a seat at the table, those most impacted, right? But we follow their leadership. We say those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So it's a struggle, it's a process, but we really like for staff to be agents of change, as well as the people that are incarcerated inside of the prisons and jails across the country. And our research is grounded in their experience. On the flip side of that, there is a lot of times a healthy mistrust on behalf of communities and people that have been system impacted, namely communities of color. And it's rooted again in the history of oppression, right, at the hands of law enforcement and again the DOCs and the JJCs and the PDs, not public defenders, but police departments. So again, on behalf of community members, that trust is sacred and it must be earned. And the work that we do with our research and technical assistance is showing agencies how to earn that trust, how to partner with and follow the lead of communities and justice impacted people.
Thanks very much, RASHAAD. I really appreciate that perspective. I appreciate you charitably saying not public defenders when you said PDs, but also public defender offices and indigent defense are kind of my area of expertise. And I think that your points really need to be heard in those spaces too. Building power and building community relationships for the people we serve, as opposed to building our own power or whatever that might look like in a public defender office. That's a message that I think even public defenders can benefit from hearing and do work in that area to invite affected populations to participate in their own liberation as opposed to come in as saviors. That's sort of a running discussion that happens in the public defender space and needs to happen more and more. So I really, really appreciate that perspective. And I think it's anybody in any piece of the whole system can learn from that. We'll now turn to our sort of round 3 questions, which are about our planning for the future and how we can really think about how to effectively do our work in the area, in the era of a pandemic, you know, and when there are so many limitations on what we do. I'll invite Judge Mendelsohn to speak a little bit about the philosophy of balancing what could be competing justice objectives, don't have to be, at different system points, and what should people take into consideration when thinking about law enforcement and youth at this time, and the courts as well. And I think that question of what should people be considering about law enforcement is particularly potent given our moment. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, so I will begin with an area where there are competing interests and values, and it's not necessarily all within the justice system, but it has to do with this particular era that we find ourselves in as we are dealing with a public health crisis. We have competing and conflicting values and priorities when we think on one hand of the fact that we are in a public health crisis. So we have to think about the public health safety components of the work that we are doing in our courthouses and beyond. We have to care about the safety of the public, as well as the judges, the staff, the attorneys who appear in our courts, law enforcement, probation officers, and service providers who are still called upon to serve our communities during this crisis and beyond. We have to consider protection from what has been a vicious and life-threatening illness. But that legitimate concern about public health and safety can rub against our basic mandate to provide due process, a speedy trial, a complete court process, which as I explained when I said we can't convene a grand jury, we can't have jury trials, we can't have these contested and evidentiary suppression hearings under the law as we have suspended it temporarily during the crisis. So we have the competition of public health crisis and caring about the health of our court system players and the public as it relates to someone who has been, our system of government says when someone is arrested, they have a right, certain rights that the government has an obligation to meet. So that there is some competition there. I don't believe that there has to be competing criminal justice system and juvenile justice system competing values in places that others see competing values. And the one that comes to mind is the idea that we have to protect community safety. And we often hear of that as one of our system's goals. Our criminal and juvenile justice systems are to care about community protection and safety. And oftentimes that is thought to be something different than caring about the particular and individual interests of the person who has been arrested and is accused of offending. And the thought is that it's competition. It's either community protection versus the interests of this, and we're talking about youth, this young person who has been arrested. And I like to remind people when I talk of these issues that if we are paying close attention to strength-based specific interventions and alternatives to our alternatives to incarceration for young people who are brought into our system, if we direct that level of intervention appropriately, you are going to have a resulting enhancement of community safety. So it's not necessarily either or. You're caring about the community or you're caring about this young person. If you are putting in the appropriate community-based resources and alternatives to incarceration, and they are impactful and they're directed and they're specifically targeted to the needs of this young person, you can at that same time engage in community protection, and that adds value. Actually, our juvenile justice laws in New York State recognize that. We are required in our juvenile justice system to continue interests of the child in terms of removing them from their homes and having them confined. We're required to consider alternatives to incarceration before we can consider confinement in most cases. I'm going to bring us back to when we talk about the role of law enforcement as we think of this season. I already mentioned something that I think is critically important. We were on a more than 10-year journey in New York State to reduce the touch of our systems, our justice systems, on young people. And so we dramatically reduced the arrests and dramatically reduced the number of young people who are being incarcerated. So at this time that this crisis of COVID-19 hit our systems, we were at a low point in terms of the number of young people who were actually confined in our systems. And during the height of the pandemic, at least in the New York City area where things are really, really very difficult for us in terms of the number of positive cases and hospitalizations and critically ill people and deaths, and our police officers were getting sick and there were really reduced operations at every level, and people were obeying the stay-at-home directives from our government leaders, we had very few arrests. And what we saw when we looked at the arrests that were happening during that season, they were for very, very serious crimes of violence and domestic violence and higher level felonies. And so that begs the question, if we can do this in a season of crisis, how do we prevent ourselves from going back to business as normal? How can we, as we start to come to a different phase in our resumption to in-person operations in our courts and in our communities, not resort to our past practices of automatically having our justice system touch in all situations? So of course I'm talking about a word that we don't always use in criminal justice in the way we use it in our child welfare spaces, but prevention. And when I talk about prevention, I'm not talking about net widening. I'm not talking about ways to have more eyes on community members that may result in higher rates of incarceration. I'm talking about really utilizing and working with our community partners who are on the ground and understand the young people and their families in our communities, and how do we engage them and work with them to interrupt the expectation that certain of our children are going to be system involved in the future.
I really appreciate that approach, especially the first thing that you said about there isn't actually a conflict between community protection and the best interest of our children and people who have a risk of systems involvement. I think that's a false choice that we sort of feel forced into by the way that the systems and structures are sometimes configured, and that we don't want, that we don't have to make that false choice. If we pull back, we rethink how we involve with communities and how we structure the relationship between justice systems and the community to really remove what looks like a choice between two things, but is actually the same desire. Community protection and child's best interest are the same desire. They only look like sort of a false choice from the wrong perspective. So I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that insight. I'd like to ask now Josh to contribute some thoughts as we think practically about the foreseeable impacts the pandemic may have on youth and young adults. And we overlay this with the pandemic's post-adjudication and reentry impacts. What are the access issues that the pandemic is highlighting? And specifically, somebody in a question actually mentioned, if you have any ideas on this, how are we ensuring that people re-entering the community have the sort of safety gear that they might need in this very strange pandemic world, things like that? I don't know if you've seen any examples of that.
I mean, this is the essential question, because I think that you're seeing very few advocates who are just calling on governors to throw the doors open, and let the kids out. There needs to be a reentry plan. There needs to be a network of support services. Now, we know that the money exists for these things. In the state of Georgia, they are closing one of their juvenile prisons, and the line item for the Department of Juvenile Justice there is going to be $10 million less for the year following than for the year of that closure. $10 million it took to run that facility. So we know that the money exists. The question is whether we're going to spend it on things that actually benefit kids' lives. So when we look at a re-entry plan, there's key things that would be part of a transition plan, making sure that kids are enrolled in Medicaid and or CHIP, depending on how the state operates, Children's Health Insurance Plan. Identifying and funding the community-based services that can benefit kids. Any of the services that are taking place behind the walls of these facilities, to what extent can they take place in the community? Because we certainly know that counseling and drug counseling and any number of other mental health services can certainly take place outside the walls of a facility. Families need money for things like cell phones, for internet access, to make sure that they're connected to these things. So I don't have a great handle on money being repurposed for that, for the things that I'm talking about. But I certainly would be happy to see in the chat box examples that people have heard about locally. And I saw that we have a number of practitioners from around the country who may be able to talk about successes that they've had locally, putting money toward programming outside of the prisons.
Yeah, I think this is a really great opportunity to hear about those kinds of efforts. And also, as we're, even with Judge Mendelson's comments, talking about how we restructure and rethink what safety looks like and what child protection looks like, that investment in the community and involving the community is a really important aspect of that. And even in what you're saying about reentry services and things like that. I would like now to turn to RASHAAD to talk about, speaking of sort of communities and things like that. The landscape and pathways for emerging adults in this country are radically shifting. And when thinking of the pandemic's impacts on the current political and social responses to oppression and the experience of young adults of color who have been involved in the justice system, how can methods like restorative transformative justice and participatory action and research help us shift in a way that helps us rethink that? And I might have sort of presaged some of the more specific stuff you want to say, and I'm sorry about that, but please, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Steve. No, you're fine. So kind of twofold. One on restorative justice and another on participatory action research. Again, furthering the point I was making earlier about the three questions that restorative justice asked, and how that kind of like intersects with participatory action research. So that first question about what happened, right? I think it's very empowering, if you give a very robust and comprehensive answer to that question, right? Again, COVID-19 and mass incarceration have been on this collision course for some time now. So for a young person to situate themselves, right, within all of that, right, it's empowering, right, for young people to know their histories, where they come from, how they came to be in the place that they're at, and what might be the next steps. What have others done in their position in an endeavor to liberate themselves and their community and their people? The impact, right? We know that Black and brown people bear the brunt of the impact of COVID-19 as well as mass incarceration. So in situating ourselves in that, right, we find young people oftentimes find a greater connection to their community at large, right? That kind of collective experience that is oppression. And to repair that harm, right? Again, to have young people and those that are most impacted take the lead. That is the only way to do it, considering the way that research has been weaponized in the past against communities of color, right, to sustain white supremacy, and create arguments that other minority groups are somehow inferior. To the participatory action research kind of framework that we use, our values come before the research. Like I said earlier, Restoring Promise is a values-led initiative, unapologetically. And one thing that participatory action research does, it addresses power dynamics. Oftentimes, researchers go into situations where it's kind of like the researcher and then there's the researchee, where the researcher has his pen and his clipbook, kind of extrapolating knowledge and data from the research subject. Traditionally, however, the way that we do it using the participatory action research framework, we continually ask for consent, right? We're meeting people in a prison, we're meeting people in community, wherever they're at, right? Is it okay for me to be here? Do I have your permission to move forward? At any time, if this is uncomfortable, if you don't want to participate, it's fine. You're not going to lose anything. There will not be any repercussions behind your choice to not participate. Again, censoring the person on the other side, not quote unquote the research subject, but it makes me think of what we say, the practitioners in the field, no research with on us, without us, right? So the research is in partnership with, not on people. Again, rooted in that history of epistemology with a racial lens, thinking about not only the monopolization of the production of knowledge, but the weaponization of quote unquote science. And lastly, PAR, as colloquially called, participatory action research, that A in PAR is politicization. It is, what happens when a young person is engrossed in their history and involved in their community. Politicization.
Thanks, RASHAAD. Again, sorry for sort of stepping into some of your initial comments. I really think that observation of the role of researchers in making values-based decisions, even in framing research questions, is underappreciated sometimes in a research context. And that's a really important point. I'm reminded of, through the Data for Black Lives movement, hearing some describe the goal of research to be not to turn the surveillance apparatus on people who are already its victims. So we don't necessarily want to surveil people to get data about their activities if they're already in impacted populations. We instead want to find ways maybe to surveil the people who are impacting those populations. Or again, the framework you were discussing is even better, the participatory research and community-based research. And on that question of research and partnerships and things like that, our sort of last round of formal questions, I will turn to all panelists to talk about what stakeholder innovations are developing in your communities, among your partners, in your field. What impacts are you seeing or expecting? And from your vantage point, what are the questions or implications for research and practice? I'll turn first to Judge Mendelsohn, but again, we want to hear more about the partnerships that are springing up, but also what the implications might be for researchers who want to enter this space and learn more. What questions might we ask in the research context? Sorry, just one.
Are you going to hear from everybody about the innovations and then we'll go back again to talk about the innovations, or should I throw it all in there at this one point?
I think to make sure we have enough time for questions, it'd be great if we could talk about the research along with the area of partnerships and innovations. considering you could think of research as possible partnerships, right, between people who are running these systems and helping people through the systems to partner with researchers. So what kind of questions might you ask in that context? So yes, sorry if that was not clear.
So give it everything.
Let's hear it.
Shake me up. That's okay. It's okay. I've got this. So in terms of the innovations that we've been seeing recently, I had 4 major things to discuss with you, and I'll try to be as brief as possible because we do want to engage in the question session. But the first practice and innovation that I wanted to talk about is, and it's been talked about a few times during the course of this forum, and that is the deliberate practice of reviewing cases and circumstances of confined youth with an eye towards assessing the continued need for confinement and detention or placement. That is something new in the sense that, yes, we generally make those types of determinations early on in a case, and if there's a specific request to change that status, but the idea that we should be, for all youth who are confined, taking a look throughout the time that the youth is in our segment of the system and making sure that confinement is necessary is an innovation that I hope that we maintain. And it's not something that is simply the responsibility of defense counsel. And I think that's what we learned during this season. They shouldn't be the only ones advocating for appropriate release in appropriate circumstances. We have seen our courts, and I'm proud of our courts for this, we had a court-led internal review where our judges were looking at all of our young people who were on our dockets and confined and bringing in the advocates to make those arguments about whether or not confinement needs to continue. It can come from places like the Office of Children and Family Services in New York State, which is responsible for some placement facilities for juvenile justice system young people. They did their own internal review where they selected certain young people who were coming to the end of their dispositional time in their facilities, or were at a place where even the system detention leaders came to the court saying, these are young people we recommend be considered for early release from their time of confinement. In New York City, we did have the presentment agency, which would be the agency that is prosecuting the juvenile justice case, do their own internal review of young people who were confined in secure detention facilities and non-secure detention facilities, and along with the defense counsel presented these matters to the judges who made the determination to release quite a few. I would say many young people were released in that process. So the concept of taking a good look at the young people who are confined and making a determination as to whether or not that should continue. The second innovation has to deal with our role of probation throughout the state. My first example, well, first I'll state that probation services throughout the state continue to successfully divert cases from the justice system out as an exit ramp from justice system involvement throughout this crisis. And they had to utilize different ways of doing this because probation generally is a hands-on, in-person type entity. And there was still a lot of that going on, but much reduced. Just this week, just last Friday, I saw an article in a local newspaper, Hometown Youths Create Rainbows for Nursing Homes and Hospital. Now, we're used to seeing that type of article, that type of feel-good article in our newspapers in this season, where students are gathering and young people are gathering and creating art to beautify nursing homes and to make the first responders and the residents and the staff feel good. But guess what? These were youth who were under probation supervision in Warren County in New York State, who were involved in restorative justice practices, and they got the media attention for doing something positive for the nursing homes. So our departments of probation are being very, very active. In New York City, our Department of Probation, I checked in with our youth leader for probation in New York City to see how things were going. And Janine Gray, I'll say her name, she has a motto, one size fits one. and she's maintained that for the decades of work that she's done. She's had to revamp how she addresses youth who are on probation or youth who she's trying to divert out of our system entirely, but she's still doing that active work in person, her probation officers in person and online. So using creative methods of reaching young people and taking care. We learned, and it was said quite well earlier in another forum, that we can't use probation and other entities as mere surveillance, where we're checking on people and giving opportunities. Are you doing badly? We may have to bring you back in. That's not the role, but the role is to actually offer useful service and what needs are not being met and help to fill those needs, engagement and true service. The third example I provide of an innovation has to do with a community-based alternative to incarceration. As an example of this community-based organization, and it's just one of many doing great work, and I'll shout them out because I'm using them as an example. They're called Avenues for Justice. They moved their in-person work with young people, where they would provide tutoring and other workshops and vocational education in person. They moved all that online, and so many people had to do that, and that's difficult. And we have yet to see whether it's as effective or do young people engage online better than adults, and all of that needs to be seen. So maybe that's a place for some research, but they had to revamp and add to their portfolio of work. Yes, they're providing online vocational and educational services and tutoring, but they're also delivering to the homes of the youth that they care for computers, phones, tablets, and groceries. People need to eat. We know that COVID is hitting our low-income communities at higher rates. Not only are they being infected at higher rates, the outcomes are much more difficult, and we have a frail and fragile economic system and budget crisis coming our way. Groceries are our children eating, and they have revamped their work to make sure that families are being fed, and we need to support that type of work. The final innovation has to do with, wellness checks by a community court. One of our community courts had to suspend their operations because what they were dealing with weren't the essential emergency operations at the outset, but they never stopped for a minute their work. The community court, and it's in Red Hook in New York, and they're a very famous, nationally known community court, did wellness checks of every human being that was in their court system under their jurisdiction. Once again, not surveillance, but wellness checks. Are your needs being met? Certain drug programs and other programs aren't operating optimally. What do you need, and how can we help service you? Not a traditional role for a court, but different times require different responses. So those were the innovations, and I will quickly run to the areas of research or policy looks that I'd like for us to really wrap our brains around. I say us, it's the royal us, it's the researchers and the other policy leaders who know how to make this happen. How do we safely keep rates of confinement at historic lows while maintaining the community protection that we've been able to maintain in recent years? And this is not related to demonstrations that we are seeing, but even before we started entering this season where we're talking about protests and demonstrations and the impact on our justice system of that, which we must look at, I was pondering, how are we going to prevent what many expect to be a very, very horrible, inevitable economic crisis and a result in enhanced crimes that are related to economic crises? How do we not have an increase in crime when we are going to have fewer jobs and fewer opportunities and people in crisis, and combine that with people who have been cooped up for a very, very long time? So how do we maintain all of these gains that we worked so hard to receive over the last decade or more, and not resort to a society that is less safe? We recently, in some meetings of the Governor's Task Force on Raise the Age here in New York, learned that some early data was promising about racial and ethnic disparities in terms of our justice system youth. Now, the data was early, but we know as we reduce systems, we do not always reduce the disparities that we see. And that's been our struggle in New York State. But we were told that there was some there was some information that we were able to see recently where we were having some improvements in our racial and ethnic disparities at all system points involved in the juvenile justice system. So there was some promising data. We only touched upon it a little bit. I'm hoping that that's not just anecdote and it is real, that we are able to move that needle in terms of racial and ethnic disparities that concern us so much. So I'm asking the researchers, if it's true that we are making some improvements in that area, how do we do it? And how do we maintain it and improve upon that? Also, I'm asking us to take a look at our crossover youth. I work in a number of systems, as I mentioned, family justice, child welfare, juvenile justice, emerging adult justice, adolescent justice. We can have as many systems as we want to have with the same children and family members. I'm worried about crossover youth. We're told that maltreatment increases in times of crisis. We're told that domestic violence and other family violence increases in times of crisis. We're told that those who usually might alert the authorities to harm that's happening to children, like our school teachers and others, and are not seeing our young people in the same way they used to see them. So there is a concern about increased harm to children. So if that's true, and we're, as I mentioned, and I don't want to harp too much on it, but we have to be real, a lack of economic resources, are we going to be seeing increases in actual child maltreatment, and how do we interrupt that? And how do we meet if there's going to be an expanded need and an increase in harm in that area, how do we meet that particular need? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm especially interested in the last couple of things you mentioned. We're really studying what the impact of a crisis can be while the crisis is happening. And a lot of crisis kind of moments afterwards, we think about what can we measure about what happened during this crisis. But because this happened so quickly, it's so interesting to see there might be research opportunities to analyze what's in real time almost, what the crisis is doing and how we can respond maybe even almost in real time, to lessen the effects of that crisis on youth and on their families. So that framing of the research issues is really, really interesting to me. Thanks very much. Josh, we'll turn to you now. Again, the sort of framing question was, what innovations are we seeing and are developing within our communities, among our partners, et cetera? What impacts from that innovation are we seeing, and what possible research opportunities do we see going forward? What questions might we ask in the research context?
Yeah, so I already touched on the innovations, and none of this is especially new, what I've been talking about. The idea that like an empty building that no one's using should be closed, that's not like, no great innovator came up with the idea that if you have 10 kids spread over 2 buildings in rural Maryland, that you don't need to keep those places open. I think one of the things that's been very interesting is seeing like in California, where the governor has talked about closing 4 of their juvenile facilities and devolving things to the counties as an alternative. The governor there talked a long time about doing that, and now is couching that in the budget pressures that the state is surely going to face. So I wouldn't call either of those innovations, but they are certainly changes that I think are on the horizon, and I expect to see more of that, if only due to the high pressures that budgets are going to be under over the next fiscal years. You know, when it comes to the questions that I have for researchers out there, I think that there's a fascinating experiment happening in real time with the school to prison pipeline. You know, the declines in school-based arrests that I mentioned in North Carolina are remarkable, and the kids haven't changed. It's just that their environment has changed. And you know, the presence of school resource officers certainly has the ability to drive kids, especially kids of color, into the justice system for ordinary adolescent misbehavior. So what is the research going to show in this time that our public schools are closed and that the school resource officers are out doing something else? The kids are not being arrested. So what has changed? The other question that I have for research is, you know, to look at proof for what we've known for a long time, which is that our prisons, both juvenile and adult, do not make us safer. The long-term declines in juvenile incarceration, going back to the start of this century, have aligned with long-term drops in juvenile arrests, which is the best measure that we have for the drops in juvenile crime. So that is continuing to happen and happening on an even accelerated basis. Now, in 1992, the US Attorney General, a man named, I have it in my notes, Bill Barr, I'm not sure what happened to that guy, but he wrote a paper, gave a speech titled "The Case for More Incarceration." And he said, the argument for more incarceration makes three basic points. First, prisons work. Second, we need more of them. Third, inadequate prison space costs money. So whatever happened to that man, and I'm sure that he's been just humiliated from being so wrong and proven wrong immediately upon giving that speech, we really have to prove again to people in the corridors of power that prisons don't work, that we can invest in our communities, and the prisons are not what makes us safe.
Thanks very much, Josh. I really appreciate the also the perspective that some of these innovations, we don't want to give them sort of too much credit, right? They're things that might seem kind of common sense and are sort of bare minimums to a certain extent. But it is good to recognize that we are finally reaching some common sense things that seemed out of the realm of possibility in our climate before now. So I really appreciate that perspective. Now I'll turn to you, RASHAAD, to give us your thoughts on innovations and collaborations happening within your circles, what impacts you would expect to see from those innovations and collaborations, and finally, what maybe research questions, new research questions we might pursue as a result of this crisis.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I'll start with that last one. What are the impacts that I'm seeing or that I expect to see? What I'd like to see, this makes me think of Angela Davis, just to bring her into this space, is, we need to imagine a world where prisons don't exist. Angela Davis says in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, but we must be anti-racist. And thank you to my fellow panelists who have talked about the disparities at length. Straight up, we're not gonna program our way out of this. There is no one program that's gonna solve this. Communities, community-based organizations sustain themselves and have done so for a while on shoestring budgets well outside their scope. And to strengthen and invest in community instead of, like I think Josh just said, more prisons and making prisons better, I think that's a better way to go. And in part to your second question about the research implications and the research questions, one thing I might have left out earlier is, I alluded to the exploitive nature of research that has been done on communities of color. But to put our values first and meet people, where they're at, what are their needs? Ask them what they need, right? Because a lot of times we can assume or come with a cookie cutter prescriptive kind of approach, but I think we can learn a lot if we take a step back and ask people before we just, swoop in to intervene, ask people what it is that they need, or how can the system or researchers help. And I think about the way that we pay people for their time, right? I talked a bit before about the extrapolation of data from people and communities of color, but what are we giving back? So I just wanted to put that out there. And also in our engagements with people in community and doing the research, I think some of the innovations going forward might be leveraging the use of technology, not only in the research, but again, but also in the provision of services and programming.
Thanks very much, Rashad. My personal hope also is that the abolitionist conversation will only be strengthened, heightened, and become more mainstream as things move forward, because I think that's a really critical perspective that provides a real concrete path forward in thinking about how to resolve these kinds of issues. I think it's time for us to now turn to Q&A. That I think means all of our panelists are going to join us together. There we go. And the first question that we had come in that we want to answer is about access to justice in rural areas and the unique challenges that presents. I think Greg is going to be able to talk about this, the unique challenges faced by criminal justice actors as a result of the pandemic in rural communities. I believe Greg is still muted.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yes, sure thing.
Rural America, rural New York State is a challenge, right? Most of us who have spent any time trying to do anything in the rural parts of our country and in the rural parts of New York State quickly come to realize that there's no one cookie cutter rural community that you can take and transplant or transport across different parts of the state. There are some rural parts of the state that have colleges and universities attached to them. And so they present a different picture than those who are so service poor that there's only one cab that can take anybody, any place in the county, and that cab driver is ripping people off of their prescriptions. And that's a real story as I was working up New York State on some health equity issues. So I think we've got to realize a couple of things. One, in terms of the youth justice and justice context, there's not a lot of resources. Sometimes these rural communities only have very few police officers, not many people to provide the kinds of probation services, and those services have the challenges of being very far apart for people who often don't have a lot of good public transportation, and private transportation is a matter of asking your aunt or your uncle to use their car at some point during the week. You also have an older population, and I think you have a population, that has a lot of health challenges, both within the youth population, but also in the adult population. So the lens of justice and youth justice in the rural communities is something that our agency has been looking at for a while now. We do have a rural learning collaborative, and we discovered that what many in the rural communities need is to be connected, not just broadband with an internet, but to be connected so that they can support one another, learn from one another, and hear from one another so that there can be an exchange of ideas and programs and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're looking at now, because some of this is really the infrastructure that we can't address, but the provision of services, the monitoring of how rural communities are doing. The COVID-19 virus has not even manifested itself in rural America yet, but it is coming. And so how can we prepare, a stressed community that is already very poor, that already has a lot of health issues, that doesn't have a lot of services, and is often lost and forgotten? How can we prepare them for what is coming their way? And so I think what we've got to really focus on is asking the questions that we're asking now of other communities in what could be described as urban or suburban communities, and see if we can't get ready for what is going to be happening when this pandemic makes its way into the rural world.
Thanks very much, Greg. That's the rural and urban divide is one that's always really potent in how these issues are talked about and how criminal justice issues are talked about. I had a question come in that I'm really interested in the answer for, that's, I think, directed more specifically to Judge Mendelsohn, but if anybody has any thoughts, please share them. For those who are not being released as a result of COVID-19 sort of things, the people who are staying in, what are the barriers to getting people released? And has there been any analysis of whether different areas and different judges are using similar standards, different standards, et cetera?
So to answer that question, I'll remind us that each individual circumstances of an arrest that comes before a judge is unique. And there are circumstances related to the factors resulting in the arrest, as well as the factors of the young person's life who is accused that are taken into consideration. In New York, we recently have had significant bail reform. So for the youth who are in the adult justice system, the bail laws that traditionally apply to adults, while they are still in the adult system, and most of those cases, more than 80% go to the juvenile justice system ultimately. But while they are in the adult system, that the ones that remain in the adult system are the more serious, violent cases involving significant physical injury, involving sex offenses, or a deadly weapon. Those cases tend to stay in the adult justice system. But even with those cases, a number of those, many of those young people are at liberty as their cases are progressing. So when you look at the circumstances of the young people who remain confined in the adult justice system, they are people for whom the bail laws, which have been recently revamped, have been applied after argument from the prosecutor and defense counsel, and the judge making an individuated determination that bail would be set or remand would be set because of the nature of the circumstances of the offense and that young person's life. In the family court juvenile justice system, where we are at an all-time low in the number of young people who are confined, even before COVID, a really low number of young people confined in non-secure detention facilities as well as our detention facilities. Those young people will have had a risk assessment instrument. The court would have had to consider their risk of reoffending, because that is the standard in the juvenile justice system under our laws, as well as flight risk, and whether or not allowing them to remain at home and in the community is contrary to their welfare and best interests. And the courts also are required in those cases to consider whether alternatives to incarceration have been considered for those young people. So there are a number of factors. I want to stress that it is the majority of young people are at liberty, but there are young people who are confined, but they've had a court process that has made those types of assessments.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question that piqued my interest specifically is it's for Josh, about data collection, getting access to data, barriers to that. That's always something I'm very interested in. Our questioner says you've engaged in amazing detective work to collate the data behind your dashboard that you've created. But what does optimal access to data look like in this new normal? What are the barriers currently in place that get in the way of transparency when reporting this kind of information?
So I'm flattered by the preface to the question, but it really has not been amazing detective work. I want to be clear about that. You know, I get Google News alerts that I set up terms like, you know, coronavirus and juvenile and COVID and youth and a set of things like that. And that's led me to a number of articles that then have often led me to government websites. What has been frustrating is really the lack of reporting from government agencies. So I'm looking at, I would say, about 20 states every single day that I go to statewide trackers saying varying levels of information. And that gets to what the real question was of what maybe a gold standard might be for transparency. And there's scraps of this out there. Some states are doing some things well and some states are doing other things well. So I look at Maryland, for example, which has a daily update, both for its public facilities and for the privately managed facilities that Maryland youth are sent to. And I don't think any state other than Maryland has in fact reported that. And that's important because those are Maryland youth who have been sent out of state. You know, a set of them were sent to a place in Arizona called Mingus Mountain Academy, where 84 kids came down with the virus. It's the biggest single spot. And I only knew about that early on because of the fact that Maryland was reporting that the staff there had in fact gotten ill first. And in fact, you know, there was later reporting that discovered that, that there was an effort to keep that hidden. Obviously not very effectively, because families can and do speak up, and journalists and public defenders speak up as well. So knowing what's happening in the private facilities, knowing what's happening with negative test results as well. So for example, Georgia has let us know that 3 kids in the 27 facilities in Georgia have tested positive. And I've emailed with a department of, what do they call it, like a public information officer there. And I said, great, glad to know there's 3. How many tests have there been? Well, they've tested 3 kids and come back with 3 positives. So I look at Indiana, and Indiana has been reporting negative test results along with positive test results. That's important to know so that we have a scope of the problem. Lastly, I think it's important to know the number of youth who are in isolation or quarantine. The County of Los Angeles in California has done a very good job reporting the number of kids in the facilities, the number of kids being tested every day, the number of kids going to those medical isolation. I don't have a great handle on the difference between medical isolation and solitary confinement. I certainly hope that it's different. One may be medically necessary, the other is inexcusable in almost all circumstances. So to know what is happening in those facilities is important. I urge you, if you care about this data, if you have found it useful, subscribe to your local newspaper. I found out what's happening in Colorado because a reporter at the Denver Post was chasing this information down. I wasn't aware of any of this. And when he did, eventually the Colorado Department of whatever they call it out there issued a report that they'll be updating regularly. Start following that man on Twitter. He got furloughed from his newspaper. Now, that is going to be a similar story that happens everywhere. I am absolutely reliant on newspapers and to a lesser extent, national public radio stations in local communities. So that is what has led me to the data. That is what has updated the data. And it is still so limited. You know, you're asking what's missing. What's also missing is for every state to be providing the things that are populating my report. So when I say that there's more than 500, there's at least 500. I certainly expect that there's more than that. And I hope that you will do everything that you can to keep pushing for the existence of that data in your communities.
Thanks very much, Josh. I know in my work, especially in the indigent defense arena, the question of how do we get data from people who are really providing services, but also from prosecutors' offices, et cetera, and how do we get that data sort of make sense with each other? It's a very long-standing challenge. Mm-hmm. And so it's no surprise that you're hitting some of the same barriers with this process. The next question, are we seeing or do we expect to see a strain on the foster care or adoption system during this time? This could be due to young children losing parents to this unfortunate disease, but you know, any other sort of strains happening in that area of child welfare. I don't know if any of our panelists have anything to contribute on that. Judge Mendelsohn, looks like you have something.
Yes, I do oversee the Child Welfare Court Improvement Project for our state, which is a federally supported and state operated in all of our jurisdictions in the country endeavor to ensure that our courts are involved with our community child welfare agencies and advocates who represent parents and children and our community members in ensuring that young people who are involved in the foster care system have the best possible process for their time in foster care, with a goal of reunifying with parents wherever possible and family members, and when not, ensuring that young children and older children receive what is referred to as permanency, which is a forever home that we are all entitled to and should have, with loving family members to take care of us for life and support us for life. So I've been in many spaces where we talk about concerns about our child welfare system during the pandemic. There have been issues in terms of, I will tell you that child welfare agencies have been made aware by the federal government as well as our state authorities, and everyone is working very, very hard to ensure that they meet their mandate to ensure that parents, particularly children who are away from home in foster care settings, have contact with their families whenever it is safe to do so, and where it's not safe to do so, to ensure that there be telephone contact, video contact, contact in the way that we're doing now, which is not optimal, but it is contact. We're still able to proceed, and to ensure that young people's needs are being met. We are not seeing foster parents, saying, I won't be a foster parent anymore because, there's a COVID crisis. But we are seeing a lot of anxious parents who don't have that contact that they are used to having with their children, and they deserve to have with their children in this season. But we do see child welfare agencies and advocates and community-based organizations really struggling and fighting and doing their best to ensure that our children are protected. There's some concern for young people who are the older adolescents who may be nearing that time where they age out of foster care. There is concern about making sure we as a society meet our obligation to not allow children, particularly during this crisis season, to age out, meaning no longer have the support of the foster care system because they've reached 18 or 21. So there is attention being paid to that very significant issue as well.
Thanks very much for that information. Well, I think that we wanted to use the last sort of 5 minutes as a wrap up, but I wanted to say thank you to all the panelists for being here, for engaging with the questions in a really thoughtful and meaningful way. It's been an honor to be a part of this panel, and I'm really glad to have been asked to join. And now Dr. Lopez will wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you for the elegant way in which you moderated these voices and brought together all of these experiences and expertise. I want to thank the panel. RASHAAD, thanks for reminding us of the importance of participatory research. Josh, for your focus on support for transition back to communities, and for your commitment to translating data in a way that's consumable, palatable, and fun. So thanks for that. I also want to thank Judge Mendelsohn, but in doing so, I want to revisit something that she said. She mentioned earlier how she personally in New York have worked hard and effectively to, and I quote, reduce the touch of our system on young people. And as you said that, I couldn't help but to juxtapose what you said with the images we've been seeing of that police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. So I guess what I take from this today is that much of the world has a lot to learn and can learn from the leadership that people like you, Judge Mendelsohn, have to offer, and for the strides that we're making in New York. Greg, one thing that you said at the end of your remarks, and thank you so much for framing the conversation the way you did, was you drew attention to sustainability over time and how we can invest in the future generations of leaders. I'm extrapolating a bit from what you said. And this is so important. We're talking about children, teens, and emerging adults here. This is precisely the folks that we can still reach and mold into exemplary citizens moving forward. So thank you for that. And I'd like to pivot on that note to remind everybody that tomorrow we'll be focusing on education. So very timely and relevant to this point that Greg made at the end of his remarks. I hope that everybody can join us tomorrow. If you would like to also consider participating on Friday, we have a rich day. It's a long day with two fantastic speakers followed by a panel of researchers and funders. So please consider joining us for that. I want to give the panel a last opportunity to say whatever they want, but I want to leave you all with my deepest gratitude for your participation today and for everything that you said.
It's been a privilege to be a part of it. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for this rich opportunity to listen, to learn, and to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've learned yet again, and that's always a good thing. Judge Mendelsohn, those data that you talked about with regard to the disparities, it's real, and we've seen it. And so you can rest assured that we're keeping track of that too.
Thank you, everyone. You all continue to do the great work that you're doing, and that you all stay safe in this time.
Thanks very much, everybody. I especially appreciated the focus on community participation, community outreach is a perspective that was so important, and I'm glad it was a part of the earlier panel today. And this one, it's really been an honor. Thank you very much.